The image Meghan Markle spent years constructing was precise, deliberate, and almost flawless. A woman who built her life through talent, grit, and the kind of relatable ambition audiences instinctively trust. Then Piers Morgan held up a stack of photographs on national television, and that image cracked down the middle. Not gradually, not through rumor or innuendo. All at once in front of millions of viewers, with the quiet confidence of someone who had been waiting a long time to show exactly what he was holding. These photos are real, and they change everything. The images Morgan displayed weren't blurry, weren't captioned with caveats, weren't presented with the usual editorial hedging that softer outlets lean on when they're not quite sure. They were shown, plainly, and royal commentators who have spent careers protecting the palace's carefully managed silences have not dismissed them. That matters more than most people are pausing to register. When that particular circle stays quiet rather than pushing back, it is not neutrality. It is acknowledgement. But confirmation of what was shown is almost the least interesting part of the story now. Because the question that has started circulating in the rooms where these things get discussed, quietly, carefully, with the specific kind of caution people adopt when the stakes are genuinely high, is not whether these photographs exist. It is whether they are all that exists. Morgan himself has said nothing to suggest his hand is empty. And people who know how these things work, how material surfaces, who holds it, and why they hold it until precisely the right moment, are not treating this as the full picture. Something is still being kept back. The only real question is by whom, and to understand why something is still being kept back, you have to go back to the network that built the introduction in the first place. Marcus Anderson's name does not appear in headlines with anything like the frequency his alleged role in the story warrants. He is not a senior royal. He holds no official position, but inside Soho House, the members' club empire that functioned for a particular stretch of years as something close to a social operating system for a certain stratum of ambitious, image-conscious Londoners, Anderson moved with the kind of quiet authority that formal titles rarely confer. He knew who mattered. He knew who was rising. And according to accounts that have circulated with increasing specificity in the months since the story broke, he is the connective tissue between Meghan Markle's entry into royal adjacent circles and the figures who were already embedded within them. The chain, as it has been reconstructed, runs like this. Anderson and Sarah Ferguson had an established social proximity, the kind built through years of overlapping events, shared spaces, mutual acquaintances who regarded both as people worth knowing. Ferguson, for all her complicated standing within the institution, never lost her gift for remaining relevant, for being present in rooms that mattered. And it is through that proximity, Anderson to Ferguson, Ferguson to the broader family orbit, that Meghan's earliest connections to the royal world are now being re-examined. Not re-examined warmly. The version of events Meghan has told publicly places her introduction to Harry as something close to serendipity. A blind date, a mutual friend, a love story that began cleanly and simply and without architecture. But what Anderson's alleged role implies, if the accounts are accurate, is that the architecture existed before the romance did, that the network was already in place, that the path from a Soho House member to the fifth in line to the throne was not a matter of luck but of careful, if informal, positioning. And then Harry wrote Spare. Whatever his intentions, and they were almost certainly the intentions of a man convinced he was finally telling the truth on his own terms, the memoir had the effect of corroborating details he did not realize needed corroborating. The timelines he provided, the social settings he described, the specific texture of how Meghan was introduced into his world. Critics went through it with the kind of attention usually reserved for legal documents. What they found was not fabrication. It was something more awkward. The details Harry offered in his own defense, in his attempt to humanize and contextualize the relationship, mapped uncomfortably against the Anderson account rather than contradicting it. He was confirming the geography of a story he thought he was telling differently. That is the moment the ground shifted. Not when Morgan made his remarks on air. Not when the photographs were first alleged to exist. The shift happened earlier and more quietly when a book written to settle the record inadvertently opened a set of questions its author almost certainly never anticipated. Spare did not create this situation, but it handed the people already asking questions a set of coordinates they had not previously had, which brings everything back to a specific point in time. A room, a connection, a decision about who got introduced to whom, and why, the question of what photographs exist, who is holding them, and what they might show, it does not float free of that history. It is rooted in it entirely. The decision that turned a slow burn into a wildfire was not made in a palace or a legal office or anywhere particularly grand. It was made in a television studio. Piers Morgan chose to air the photographs. That single editorial choice reactivated everything that had been sitting in suspension. The yacht trip allegations, dormant, disputed, never fully killed, came back into circulation immediately. The claims around the $30,000 per trip figure resurfaced with them, pulling attention back to the question of what exactly was being paid for, and by whom, and whether the people at the center of those trips had any idea whose orbit they were moving through. The images themselves gave the story a visual anchor it had previously lacked. You can argue with a claim. It is considerably harder to argue with a photograph. Morgan did not stop there. The post on X followed, and with it came something far more combustible. A reference to an alleged sex tape. The word alleged is doing significant work in that sentence, but the damage does not wait for verification. It never does. The moment that specific allegation entered the public conversation, the frame around everything else shifted. What had been a story about proximity and poor judgment became something with a far sharper edge. The question was no longer simply who knew whom or who sailed where. The question became what exists, in what form, and where it currently is. That escalation is the mechanism. A slow accumulation of old allegations, given a new visual trigger, then pushed into entirely different territory by a post that introduced the possibility of recorded material. 3 moves in sequence, and the story was no longer manageable by the usual tools. The careful non-denial, the spokesperson's statement, the quiet legal letter. The usual architecture of royal damage control is built for a different kind of fire. And it is worth being precise about what Morgan's intervention actually did, because it was not simply amplification. He did not take a story that was already loud and make it louder. He took a story that had largely stalled, trapped in the gravitational pull of previous royal scandals, never quite breaking free into its own distinct news cycle, and gave it traction. The photographs gave journalists and commentators something to point to. The X post gave them a direction to point in. Together, they created the conditions for a story to run, which means what began as a book's inadvertent coordinates became a broadcaster's deliberate ones. The geography of the situation did not assemble itself. Someone drew the map. Now consider who receives that map. Not the general public, who are catching up in real time. The people this lands on first are the ones who already knew the territory, who understood, before any of this was aired, exactly which connections were real, which timeline was accurate, and which questions, if ever properly answered, would cause the most damage. Those people are not watching from a distance. They are inside the story. And the decision now facing them, whether to move, how fast, and in which direction, will determine whether any of this remains at the level of allegation or becomes something considerably harder to contain. Because the people inside this story have one advantage the public does not. They know what has already been decided and what is still being held back. The consequences, though, do not wait for full disclosure. They are already moving, and they move on several fronts simultaneously. Start with Meghan. The entire architecture of her post-royal life rests on a single premise, that she left a damaging institution and built something cleaner in its place. The Netflix deal, the brand partnerships, the American Riviera orchard launch, the carefully curated press rehabilitation, all of it is underwritten by the credibility of that narrative. She is not a royal, she is someone who survived royalty. That is the product. That is what is being sold. Any credible documented connection to Andrew, not rumor, not proximity, but specific, visual, dateable evidence, does not just complicate that story. It detonates it. Because the question it raises is not only about the connection itself. It is about what she knew, when, and whether her account of her years inside the institution has ever been the whole truth. Netflix does not carry reputational liability out of loyalty. It carries it out of calculation. The moment the calculation changes, the arrangement changes with it. Her partners are watching exactly the same coverage her audience is. The difference is they are reading the fine print on their contracts at the same time. Then there is Harry. He has staked his public identity on a very specific version of events. The memoir, the interviews, the testimony delivered under oath during the phone hacking litigation. He told the world, in his own words, what his life inside the institution looked like and who the architects of his misery were. If images surface placing his wife in proximity to one of the most toxic figures the royal family has produced in a generation, the question that follows him is not a comfortable one. Did he know? If he knew and said nothing, he is complicit. If he didn't know, then the man who positioned himself as the family's great truth-teller was, by his own implied standards, naive in ways that matter. There is no third reading, both versions damage him. And unlike Meghan, Harry's credibility is not protected by brand deals or corporate partnerships. It is the product itself. Once it goes, there is nothing underneath it. Andrew, meanwhile, has been staging a quiet, slow-motion attempt to re-enter some version of public life. The briefings from his camp, the occasional sighting, the suggestion that those around him believe the worst is behind them. All of that effort is predicated on the assumption that the story has found its floor. It hasn't. Every time his name re-enters the frame, and this situation puts it back there with considerable force, the institution absorbs another blow. Not because the public has forgotten what he did, but because his continued existence within royal structures, however reduced, makes the family complicit in his proximity. The palace has worked for years to create distance. This closes it again without anyone having to move. And then there is the question that this entire story has been circling. If photographs exist, specific, authenticated images of Meghan with Andrew, taken during the years she has never fully accounted for publicly, then everything described above does not happen in sequence. It happens at once. The narrative collapses inward from multiple directions simultaneously. Meghan's brand story, Harry's credibility, Andrew's fragile attempt at rehabilitation, the institution's carefully managed distance from all of them, all of it becomes radioactive at the same moment. Not because any single image proves any single thing, but because the existence of suppressed material, held by parties with motive to deploy it selectively, means this story does not have a natural end. It has a detonation point. And whoever holds those images holds the timing. That is the specific dread that has been building through all of this. Not the allegation itself, but the architecture around it, the deliberate coordinates, the broadcaster with an agenda, the connections that did not assemble themselves, the people inside the story who already know its shape. What they are deciding right now is not whether this becomes public. It is when, and at what cost to whom. The royals have survived scandal before. They have absorbed affairs, divorces, criminal investigations, abdications. What they have never successfully survived is a scandal that keeps producing new material, that refuses to fossilize into history, and instead keeps arriving fresh, with new names attached to old photographs. If this is that kind of story, the institution knows it, and so does everyone in it. That is the thought that does not leave the room. If this is the kind of story you find yourself needing to follow to its end, and at this point it is genuinely hard not to, subscribe to the channel. We will be here when the next part of it breaks.